Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America, Episode 33, Empire State of Play. Over the last few episodes, we followed New England from the 1690s to the 1760s. Today, we're going to begin our next series of episodes covering the history of New York over the same time period, an era of confused politics and chaotic factionalism. But before we jump into the narrative, I want to spend this episode talking about New York's culture and political life in general. Plus look at the early development of caucuses, a caucus being a convention in which parties or factions meet to decide who they want to run for office. Caucuses will be an important feature of American politics in the future, and it was around this time that they first started to meet in the bigger cities. These next few episodes will draw in particular on the book A Factious People, Politics and Society in Colonial New York by Patricia U. Bonamy. So we last left New York in the 1690s just after Leisler's rebellion had been fully suppressed. And now, New York was entering its next phase of history, a time of factionalism where new alliances formed and dissolved almost every decade. Let's start with the basics. What was New York like at this time? Well, for one thing, it was still pretty unpopulated. Around 1700, there were only 18,000 colonists in New York, with a quarter of those in New York City and a further 1,700 in Albany, the second largest city. For comparison, that's like a third of the population of Massachusetts at the time. It wasn't even as big as Connecticut. Economically, the colony was dominated by two main groups, the big merchants out of New York City and Albany, and the big landowners in the Hudson Valley between New York City and Albany. Most colonies only had one economic elite, but New York had two, which added to the factionalism New York was to experience that century. Culturally, despite the fact that New York bordered New England, it was a very different sort of place. It was mercantile, materialistic, and rather irreligious, just like it had been under the Dutch. It was also increasingly diverse and increasingly divided against itself. More so than most of the other colonies, New York was just an arbitrary geographic designation, which didn't particularly match any of the actual cultural borders that existed. After the conquest, English settlers had begun moving into New York City, but up the Hudson River there was still a very substantial Dutch population. New York City became majority English by the early 1700s, but Albany and its surrounding areas were over 90% Dutch. And you had diversity among the English as well. The Puritans on Long Island had much more in common with New England than with the rest of New York. Plus, there were a bunch of other random ethnicities sprinkled on top of that, Germans and French Protestant refugees and so on. These were all very different groups. In New York City itself they mixed together and intermarried, but in the rest of the colony they often stuck to themselves. That's why the Dutch language survived well into the 1800s. The Dutch settlers kept to themselves. And anti-Dutch prejudice survived as well. One advertisement for workers in 1807 stated that, quote, "No Dutchman need apply unless he is pretty well Yankified." So there was both integration and separation, depending on where you were. But despite the lingering Dutch presence, by now the English influence was really being felt, especially in government. The legal system was finally switched over to English common law in 1691, and there were now elections both at the local and provincial levels. And although the Dutch settlers came from a very different political culture, they eventually became accustomed to the new way of doing things. And King William had finally given New York a normal colonial government after the arbitrary rule of James II. A governor plus an appointed council of about 10 men plus an elected lower house, which was just called the Assembly. The Assembly started off with 19 men, but that number grew to 31 by the end of the colonial period. 4 representatives came from New York City, and the counties sent 2 delegates each, plus a few from the large manorial estates, which I'll talk about later. It wasn't exactly equal by population, but all the different interest groups in the colony were pretty well represented in the Assembly. Like in the southern colonies, the governor had the authority to dismiss the Assembly and to call for new elections when he wished, which significantly reduced the Assembly's independence. They controlled taxes, but they found it difficult to control how the governor actually spent that money, especially in the early years. The men elected or appointed to these positions mostly came from the upper class of lawyers, merchants, and officials, both Dutch and English. In fact, more than 85% of Assembly members came from the upper classes, and a third came from the elite, the big-time merchants and landowners, a standard enough colonial ruling class. Over the 1690s and early 1700s, they worked out the laws which would regulate elections going forward. The voting requirements were a bit more complex than normal. There were a lot of tenant farmers, and the standard 40-shilling freehold requirement would have excluded them. So instead of having to own your own land outright, it was also acceptable if you merely had a lifelong lease on land worth 40 shillings a year, which included many but not all tenant farmers. And because the urban population was so large, there were separate requirements to vote if you lived in either Albany or New York City. Basically, you had to either pay a small fee or go through training as an apprentice, and sometimes they waived the fee if you were poor. So in practice, a lot of people could vote, probably a majority of white men. Less than in New England, but still a majority. A disproportionate number of the voters were in the cities, since the requirements there were easier to meet. At the end of the colonial period, almost 70% of white men in New York City could vote, versus well under 50% in some of the rural counties. Catholics were forbidden from voting, but the situation with Jews was more complicated. Jews had been voting in New York, but in the 1730s there was a disputed election, in which their right to do so was challenged. While the assembly was deciding the case, someone made an impassioned speech, arguing that Jews shouldn't have the vote, because that was the tradition in England and also because the Jews killed Jesus. Apparently that was enough to sway the assembly, which ruled against the Jews. Although there are some later records of Jews voting as well, so it's not clear how strictly that prohibition was ever enforced. Turnout was typically in the range of 20 to 40%, which was high considering what a pain voting was in such a large colony. Turnout was higher in New York City, sometimes above 50%, but lower in the Dutch areas further north. Like in New England, turnout was negatively correlated with income. The rich voted less than everyone else. Also like in New England, there wasn't much in the way of class divisions in voting. Rich and poor men largely voted for the same people. Naturally, Dutch voters tended to vote for Dutch candidates and English voters for English candidates. So here's how an election in New York would work. At some point, the governor would dissolve the old assembly and call for new elections. Strictly speaking, he could just dissolve the assembly without calling for new elections, but that was rare, since the whole point of dissolving the assembly was to get a new assembly that would be more likely to pass your desired legislation. Anyway, after the election was called, word was sent out to the sheriffs of the various counties. The sheriffs were then given a deadline. They had to hold elections by a certain date, usually within 6 weeks of the announcement. The actual election date wasn't specified, and it varied from county to county. It was thought best to give sheriffs some discretion in picking the exact date, since, for example, recent flooding in the county might cut off some of the voters from the polling site, so a delay would help make sure that everyone could vote. But of course, this sort of power could be abused. Instead of picking a date that ensured everyone could vote, a sheriff might pick a date in which fewer people could vote. If part of the county was cut off by flooding, then you might schedule a vote as quickly as possible, if you thought that it would help you or your friends win. As we'll see, controlling the sheriffs was an important part of controlling elections in general. If you had the sheriffs in your pocket, then you could manipulate things as you wished. And there were other sorts of trickery as well, from threatening voters to shipping in people from outside the county to vote. In another instance, one candidate tried to trick the supporters of his opponents into leaving the county on election day by luring them away with fake business deals. Anyway, once the election date had been announced, then it was time to figure out who was actually running. The process was quite different than in New England. In New England, it was generally expected that people wouldn't even announce their own candidacies. Instead, the ideal was that the townsfolk would meet and discuss among themselves who should serve. Then a vote would be taken. Rational men deciding things rationally, without any partisan interference. In theory, the candidates themselves had nothing to do with the process, and in fact the towns did often nominate people who didn't wish to serve, which we know because the nominees often turned down the job, which meant that the towns had to vote again. But in New York and the rest of the colonies, it was becoming standard practice to announce your candidacy in advance, whether by making an announcement at your local church meeting, putting a notice on the courthouse door, or placing an ad in the newspaper. However, it wasn't just that individuals would decide to run on their own initiative. Often the prominent men of the county would talk among themselves beforehand to decide on a candidate that they could all support. These discussions included not only the richest guys in the county, but other important men as well, such as government officials and clergy. So in many cases the real decisions were being made privately, before the average voter ever had a chance to give his opinion. Ideally, a single candidate would be put forward, but in times of factionalism, each faction would pick its own nominee, and then voters would decide between them. This was a fairly informal way of choosing candidates. Not much more than some letters being sent back and forth between these prominent men. But it was quickly proving to be inadequate in larger towns like New York City, Boston, or Charleston. There were just too many people involved for that sort of open-ended discussion to be practical. And so the colonists came up with the idea of caucuses. That is, instead of just sending letters to each other, The leaders of a particular faction would physically get together in a room to decide on who they'd support. There aren't any clear records of when the first caucus was held, since at the time it would have been just some guys meeting together in secret. The first one we know of for sure took place in Charleston in 1735, but there are indications that they may have occurred in Boston during the 1720s and maybe even earlier in New York. We don't really know how big they were or who attended. They weren't exactly open to the public. We do have a description of a later caucus in Boston in 1763 from none other than John Adams. Quote, "There they smoke tobacco till you cannot see from one end of the garret to the other. There they drink flip, a cocktail, I suppose, and there they choose a moderator who puts questions to the vote regularly, and selectmen, assessors, collectors, wardens, fire wards, and representatives are regularly chosen before they are chosen in the town." End quote. So it was a literal smoke-filled room where leaders would secretly make deals to get people elected, well out of the public eye, just like the later stereotypes of how political parties chose their candidates well into the 20th century. Naturally, people complained about this sort of behavior. If the factions all nominated their candidates in advance, then the choices of the average voter were restricted. They could vote for someone else, but most of the time that would be a useless gesture, like voting for a third party today. But there wasn't much that could be done to stop it short of breaking up the caucus meetings, and that would just cause even bigger problems. In New York City, the first regular caucuses were held in the 1730s. During that decade, the colony was divided into factions either supporting the governor or supporting some of his opponents in the assembly. Both factions began to hold caucuses to choose their candidates, announcing their picks in the newspaper. At first, these meetings were small, limited to a few men, but over time the number of men attending grew and grew, until by the 1760s they were practically open to the public. What had started out as a private affair was coming to resemble a proper political party with mass participation. Well, a few hundred men wasn't exactly mass participation, but still. This sort of process happened in all of the big cities in America. Not every caucus had become an open meeting like in New York City, but the basic idea was similar. Outside of the big cities, caucuses were still rare, except in Rhode Island. There, caucusing had become standard by the 1740s. But once the candidates had been chosen, whether by caucus or otherwise, there wasn't yet much in the way of campaigning, at least not in the way we think of it. No political rallies, no going door to door, no debates, nothing like that. If you had to campaign, it was a bad sign. In the words of one New Yorker, quote, "To ask a man for his vote is a confession in the candidate that he is suspicious of his own merit. 'Tis proof of his apprehensions that the sense of the public is against him." End quote. You still had to put in an effort, you just couldn't be so open about it. You might give voters food and drink, you might hire carriages to take voters to the polling site, but you couldn't just go around and tell people why they should vote for you. An odd set of norms by modern standards, but I suppose it made sense at the time. In any case, even if you weren't campaigning, running a campaign was still a very expensive proposition. Let me give you one example in particular, an unusually intense election in 1733 to fill a vacant seat in Westchester County, just north of New York City. On one side you had Lewis Morris, who had recently been dismissed from the Supreme Court by the governor, and was looking to vindicate himself by being elected to the Assembly. On the other side you had William Forrester, a schoolmaster who was backed by the governor. A classic example of factionalism in colonial New York. Morris planned for this election very carefully. The sheriff was friendly to the governor's faction, and so Morris had 50 men camp out overnight around the election site to make sure that the election wasn't secretly held before he and his supporters had actually arrived. He organized multiple parades to bring in voters from every part of the county. According to historian Nicholas Varga, when the men arrived that morning, quote, "At the edge of the green a new point was added to the parade. 2 trumpeters rode at the head of the column, then came 3 violins. Next came 4 leading freeholders. One of the freeholders waved a banner which had King George emblazoned in gold capitals on one side and liberty and law on the other. Following these came the candidate Lewis Morris. 2 flags were carried behind him. Then came the body of the parade, which reportedly included about 300 horsemen. They all circled the green 3 times. After so brave a show, the formation disbanded to consume the food and drink which Morris had thoughtfully provided at 2 nearby houses. One can well imagine the backslapping, guffaws, and shouted greetings which must have punctuated the gulps of food and swallows of liquor." End quote. A little while later, William Forrester's parade arrived, but it was a much less spectacular affair, with only 170 horsemen. Both sides shouted insults at each other. This sort of behavior was common. In another election, one voter threatened to cut out the tongues of anyone who voted for the opposition candidate. But I think it's safe to say that this was all just trash talk rather than serious threats. The sheriff arrived at noon and everyone finished up their food and booze and walked out onto the village green. After another 2 hours, everything was set up and the voting began. Men lined up and made their votes out loud so that everyone could hear, while inspectors from each faction watched to make sure that the vote was properly counted. 37 Quakers were disqualified from voting because they refused to swear that they met the property requirements. Remember, Quakers refused to swear oaths for religious reasons, which could cause them legal problems. They were often allowed to vote anyway, but in this case the sheriff wanted to exclude them in order to weaken Lewis Morris's vote count as much as possible. But anyway, the year after this, a law was passed allowing Quakers to vote. Normally, the voting only took a few hours at most, but this time things dragged on for 9 full hours. It was clear that Morris, the former Supreme Court Justice, was going to win, but Forrester refused to concede defeat, so the count kept going and going until he finally gave in, when the vote was 231 to 151. The winner was announced, the crowd applauded, and everyone went to celebrate in the nearest tavern. 2 days later, Morris made a triumphant entrance into New York City, as his supporters cheered and merchant ships fired their cannons in the harbor. Most elections wouldn't have been that dramatic. Most elections probably weren't contested at all. But I think that still gives you an idea of what things were like and how elections in New York differed from those in New England. Rowdier, shoutier, but still ultimately well behaved, even if there were a few punches thrown sometimes. And the candidates spent a lot more on food and alcohol. There's one other topic we need to discuss real quick: local government. Unlike in most of the other colonies, local government in New York was a complicated mishmash. Most colonies had a standard unit of administration, towns in New England, counties in the Chesapeake, but in New York local government had developed organically over time, without much in the way of centralized control, partly because these settlements were so spread out, partly because of the frequent changes in government, and partly because there had never been a colony-level assembly to sort things out. As a result, local governments in New York had a lot of independence that they didn't want to give up, so the system was never fully rationalized. There were only 2 cities in the province, New York and Albany. They had similar governments. The governor, with the approval of the council, appointed for each city a mayor, sheriff, clerks, and other offices as needed. The voters in each town elected a number of aldermen, basically city councilmen, plus some other minor officials. So it was a lot like the government of New York itself, with an executive appointed from outside and a legislature elected from within the city itself. Given the importance of New York City especially, these offices were very important and they were frequently filled by some of the most prominent men from some of the most prominent families. In Albany, the government was controlled by local Dutch merchants who had a monopoly on the fur trade. Outside of the cities, New York was divided into large counties. At first, these counties were run by officials appointed by the governor, sheriffs and justices of the peace, and so on, but over the course of the century, elected officials gradually took charge, leaving the unelected officials with little to do. These counties were then subdivided into smaller units, either towns or precincts. Towns if the population was dense enough, precincts if the area was rural. The towns, especially the Puritan towns, were governed somewhat similarly to the towns in New England, with annual town meetings where the citizens could vote on important matters and elect officials. The men they elected were called trustees instead of selectmen, but otherwise I think things were close enough. The precincts also elected a few officials of their own, such as constables and overseers of the poor, though not as many officials as in the towns. And on top of this system of counties and towns and precincts, there were also these large private estates which were being set up in the Hudson Valley by some of the biggest landowning families. And when I say large, I mean large. One of them was bigger than Connecticut. Anyway, I'll talk more about these estates later, but the important thing is that some of them were large enough to comprise voting districts of their own, even large enough to send their own delegates to the assembly. In theory, the tenant farmers living there could vote for whoever they wanted, but in practice these elections were controlled by the family which owned the estate. Very undemocratic to have a seat in the assembly in the hands of one family like that. So, in summary, that's 2 big cities, plus counties that were divided into towns and precincts, some of which were also large private estates. Got it? Good, we're never going to talk about it again. I just wanted to show you a bit of the diversity that existed back then. In practice, the outlying communities were pretty independent from the central government. The city of Albany in particular remained a world apart, which isn't surprising given its status as the center of Dutch-speaking America. And not only was Albany different ethnically, it was also different geographically, being so far inland and close to the Iroquois and the French, and different economically, thanks to its reliance on the fur trade. And they stuck with their own religion too. It was basically a mini-colony within a colony. For example, we've already heard about how Albany was the main holdout against Leicesters' government, until an attack by the French forced them to capitulate in the name of colonial unity. And in general, Albany often wanted different policies than everyone else. While the English wanted to conquer Quebec, Albany preferred peace when possible, since war would upset their profits and leave them dangerously exposed to attack. To the English, this attitude bordered on treason. They spoke negatively of the Albany spirit. To them, the Dutch were a bunch of greedy merchants who acted selfishly at the expense of everyone else. They stuck to themselves and were biased against anyone who wasn't Dutch. One English official called them, quote, Dutch reptiles. Often these tensions could become pretty heated, though I don't think it ever broke out into violence. You might think that the ethnic tensions between the English and Dutch would be the main division in New York politics, with each side forming its own faction to fight the other. But in fact, the rivalry between the two groups was only one of the many fault lines which split New York in the 1700s. The history of New York during this period is rather complex and hard to characterize. Historians themselves seem to have had a hard time discerning patterns and figuring out what was actually going on. I have seen it described as a time of chaotic factionalism. That is, there were a lot of factions constantly forming and dissolving, without much in the way of continuity between them. The issues people fought over in the 1720s were completely different from the issues fought over in the 1730s, and all the old alliances would be completely scrambled as a result. I'm not even sure that the politicians at the time had a clear idea of what they were fighting for. It was a contentious time, much more so than in New England, and people were fighting over everything instead of just the same few issues over and over. The historian Robert J. Goff describes some of the conflicts that were important at various times throughout this period. Quote, English versus Dutch tensions, the clash of pro- and anti-Leicester factions, disputes over restricting the fur trade with Canada, efforts to secure lucrative land grants from governors, personality clashes, conflicts between churchmen and dissenters, quarrels between landed and overseas trading groups, and persistent family rivalries. End quote. So that's what we'll be covering for the next few episodes, looking at a few of the most prominent bouts of factionalism. Next time we'll begin with the 2 decades of factionalism which followed the suppression of Leicester's rebellion, as the colony tried to regain its footing. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. The podcast is on Twitter, @EarlyOftenPod, or go to the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com for transcripts of every single episode. And if you like the podcast, give it a good review on iTunes. That helps. Thanks for listening.